The Korean Mafia boss's son was blind until the new Maid discovered the truth. On the rocky coast of Maine, where the wind smelled of salt and the waves crashed endlessly against the cliffs, stood a massive glass mansion, silent, motionless, as if frozen in time. It had once been a symbol of love, success, and laughter. Now it was nothing more than a house of silence. Its owner, Jonathan Pierce, had once been one of the most feared Korean mafia bosses, an underground kingpin whose name was whispered in back alleys and boardrooms alike. But all of that power faded the day Emma, the woman he loved more than life itself, died in a yacht accident. From that day on, Jonathan disappeared from the world. He cut ties, shut down every connection, silenced every contact, left the city, and retreated to this oceanfront mansion, the very place he once promised to build as a house of light. But now that light no longer existed. At first, he tried to hold on to fatherhood. He woke early, made bottles, changed diapers, whispered the same lullabies Emma used to sing. But then the doctors came and their diagnosis shattered everything. Ryder was born blind. His eyes don't respond to light. They said it's irreversible. Jonathan sat for hours beside the crib, watching his baby lie still, eyes open yet seeing nothing. He called his name, shook a rattle, played music. But Ryder never turned his head, never smiled. The nursery, once full of colour, now felt meaningless. He blamed himself for the accident, for fate, for surviving when Emma hadn't. Each night, when he carried Ryder to bed, he whispered quietly, "You're all I have left. But even you can't see me." The mansion became a tomb. The staff moved quietly, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. No one laughed. No one spoke above a whisper. Somewhere the wind hummed through the glass walls like a sorrowful melody that never ended. Jonathan devoted every moment to his son, but the silence slowly hollowed him out. He filled the room with glowing toys, bright lights, musical boxes, anything to trigger a reaction, even a blink, a sigh. But Ryder remained still as if trapped in his own invisible world. A world without sound, without light, without anyone else but emptiness. Many nights Jonathan couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring into the black sea, listening to the waves collide against the rocks. He wondered if his son was truly blind, or if he himself had lost the ability to see hope. 6 months after that fateful day, a young woman stepped out of a black car, parked before the mansion gates. The ocean wind tossed her brown hair as she clutched an old canvas bag and a sealed envelope containing her work contract. Her name was Clara Morales. Clara hadn't come here to start a new life. She had come to escape the old one. A life that had crumbled the night her newborn son, Gabriel, took his last breath in her arms for reasons no doctor could explain. Since then, something inside her had died too. She left the city without saying goodbye to anyone, taking the first job that would let her disappear. When she saw an ad for a live-in housekeeper in a quiet oceanfront estate, she didn't think twice. Maybe silence was exactly what she needed. The butler opened the gates without a smile or a word. Inside, a stone path led to a massive white mansion overlooking the restless sea. As the doors opened, silence greeted her like a wall. No voices, no footsteps, only the sound of wind brushing against glass. The butler showed her from room to room. Everything shone, polished, perfect, untouched. The house felt alive, yet completely empty. On the walls hung photographs, a smiling woman, a newborn in her arms. Clara's chest tightened as she looked at them. "Mr. Pierce likes everything on schedule and dislikes noise," the butler said flatly. "Do your duties, nothing more." Clara nodded. She was used to cold houses and distant employers, but there was something different here, a stillness too deep, as if the walls themselves were keeping a secret. That afternoon, while tidying the living room, she noticed a few toys scattered across the rug, a small red ball, a teddy bear, a few blue blocks. She bent down to collect them, placing them neatly into a wicker basket. When she straightened up, she realized she wasn't alone. A child sat quietly on the carpet. He was tiny, pale, and motionless, his wide eyes blank and unfocused. In one hand, he held a small toy car. He didn't move, didn't look at her, didn't even seem aware that someone else was in the room. Clara froze. She had worked with children before, even sick ones, but she had never seen eyes like that. It wasn't the emptiness of blindness. It was the emptiness of a soul lost somewhere far away. The butler passed by, noticed her gaze, and said curtly, "That's Ryder, Mr. Pierce's son. He's blind. Don't try to talk to him or play with him." He doesn't respond. Clara nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the boy. When the man walked away, she knelt down slightly, lowering herself closer. Ryder remained still, staring at nothing. And in that moment, Clara felt her heart twist, not out of pity, but from a pain she thought she had buried long ago. The way Ryder stared into emptiness was the same way her own baby had looked at her before his tiny chest went still. That night, lying in the small servants' room, Clara stared at the ceiling. The sound of crashing waves mixed with the whistling wind outside. She closed her eyes, trying to forget the boy's face. But the harder she tried, the clearer he appeared. "I came here to work, not to remember," she whispered. Yet deep inside her, something had begun to stir. A fragile thread connecting two hearts that had both known loss. The next day, assigned to light care for Ryder, Clara was told not to touch him, only to tidy the room, change towels, and keep the area clean. But inside her, something stirred. A strange silence was calling her closer. That morning, as soft sunlight spilled through the glass windows, she saw Ryder lying on the rug in the nursery. He lay still, his tiny hands resting at his sides, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The light touched his pupils, but there was no reaction. He looked like a wax doll trapped in stillness. Clara knelt beside him. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered, not expecting an answer. Of course, there was none. Yet she stayed there for a while, just watching. In those blank eyes, she didn't see darkness. She saw weariness, as if the child had already given up on the world before he ever knew it. That afternoon, when the butler instructed her to prepare Ryder's bath, Clara followed the directions carefully. A small round basin sat on a long glass table, steam rising from the warm water. The faint scent of baby soap filled the air. She didn't think much, just did her job. Ryder was brought in, quiet as always, no crying, no reaction. When she gently lowered him into the water, his tiny body barely moved. She took the soft sponge, soaked it, and wiped his arms and chest slowly, tenderly, as if afraid to break him. Then, in one fleeting moment, when she lifted the sponge to his forehead, a few bubbles slid down and touched the corner of his eye. He blinked. Clara froze. She held her breath, thinking she had imagined it. She tried again, dipped the sponge, wiped gently once more. The foam rolled down, and Ryder blinked again. This time, she was certain those eyes weren't empty. They were responding. "You can feel it, can't you?" she whispered, her hand trembling. No answer came, but she could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat, echoing in the silence. When the bath ended, she wrapped him in a white towel, drying each tiny finger carefully. He remained silent, but his face looked different, not entirely vacant anymore. Something subtle had shifted. It was faint, but real. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She replayed every second of the bath in her mind. It felt too real to be coincidence. He blinked. It couldn't have been random. She stared at the ceiling, moonlight spilling through the curtains. In the darkness, a small spark of hope flickered inside her, a feeling she hadn't known since the night her baby took his last breath. The next morning, Clara entered the bathing room with her heart caught between hope and fear. A part of her wanted to believe that what she saw yesterday was real, but another part dreaded that If nothing happened today, that fragile hope would disappear like foam on the water. She prepared everything just as before. Warm water, soap, a soft towel, a small sponge. No one in the house paid attention. They saw Ryder's bath as nothing more than a daily routine, a meaningless task. But for Clara, today was different. When she carried Ryder to the table, he was as quiet as always. Morning light poured through the glass, reflecting off his pale skin. Clara gently lowered him into the water. The warmth spread, and a thin layer of bubbles formed around his shoulders and arms. She washed him carefully, slowly, like before. Nothing happened. No reaction. For a brief moment, disappointment filled her chest. Maybe yesterday had been an illusion. Maybe she was just a desperate woman seeing what she wanted to see. Then, as she dipped the sponge again, squeezed it, and wiped his forehead once more, a droplet of foam slid down near Ryder's eye. He blinked. Clara froze, her hand trembling. She tried again, this time wiping along the other side of his brow. A bit of foam slipped down his cheek, touching his skin, and then a small sound came out. "Mo!" Clara held her breath. Every part of her went still. She looked down at him, lips parted, heart racing. He said it again, slower this time, hesitant but clear enough. "Mo." The sponge fell from her hand and hit the water with a soft plop that echoed in the quiet room. She couldn't believe it, but she had heard it. The boy, the one everyone said couldn't feel, couldn't see, couldn't speak, had just said, "Mummy." Tears burned in her eyes. She sank down speechless, watching Ryder with trembling breath. He was looking toward her, and for the first time his eyes had direction, life, meaning. He lifted his hand. A tiny, wet, trembling hand reached toward her. His fingers brushed against her cheek only for a moment, but it stopped her heart. She wanted to cry out to call someone to see, but she couldn't. No one would believe her. They would say she imagined it. So she just stayed there, letting him touch her face, watching as his small eyes followed her hand when she moved it left, then right, and Ryder followed, not out of reflex, but out of awareness. Clara smiled through her tears. "You can see now, can't you?" she whispered. "You're looking." When the bath was done, she wrapped Ryder in the white towel as always. But this time she didn't feel like a maid performing a duty. She felt like she was holding a living miracle. In her arms, the baby breathed softly, peacefully. But every few seconds he stirred. A blink, a breath, a tiny motion. Each one fragile, fleeting, but to Clara they were proof of life. When she placed Ryder back on the playmat, the morning light fell across his face. He blinked faintly, then turned his head toward the brightness. Just a small motion, but enough to make Clara believe that miracles didn't, or only happen once. She knelt beside him, whispering, her voice trembling. "We'll find the light, Ryder. I promise." From that day on, Clara was no longer at peace. Every move she made, preparing bottles, folding towels, tidying rooms, was haunted by a single thought. What was truly happening to Ryder? The boy couldn't be blind. She knew it. He reacted to light, followed her hands, made sounds, reached for her face. But if that was true, how had no one seen it all this time? The question echoed inside her, like the waves pounding the cliffs outside. Over the next few days, Clara continued bathing Ryder as usual. He still blinked, still followed the light, still murmured, "Mo," whenever she wiped his face. Every reaction was living proof. But she knew proof alone wasn't enough. One afternoon, while cleaning Ryder's room, she noticed the butler walking carrying a small bottle of eye drops. He opened it, squeezed 2 drops into each of Ryder's eyes, and left without a word. Clara frowned. She had never been asked to handle that task, nor had anyone mentioned it before. Curious, she approached the silver tray where the bottle rested. The label was faded, scratched, but she could still make out a few words. Optic sensitivity control 0.2% for light response reduction. Light response reduction. Her stomach tightened. Why would anyone reduce light response in a baby already believed to be blind? She picked up the bottle, turning it carefully. At the bottom, faint letters read EXP10-203, expired nearly 6 months ago. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly put it back, afraid someone might notice, and stepped away. The rest of that afternoon, her thoughts raced endlessly. That night, after the house fell silent, Clara sat on her narrow bed, phone in hand, and began searching. She typed optic sensitivity control infant side effects. The results appeared instantly. It was a rare drug typically used for patients with extreme light sensitivity, not for infants. The description listed side effects: temporary blurred vision, reduced light perception, delayed pupil response. Her blood froze. She stared at the screen. "No, they can't be giving him this," she whispered. She remembered the routine, how everyone treated the drops as nothing, a simple daily step. Maybe they didn't know what it truly did. Or worse, maybe someone had chosen not to care. In the days that followed, Clara began to observe quietly. She tracked the exact time the drops were given, noting every change. The pattern was undeniable. Right after each dose, Ryder grew sluggish, glassy-eyed, unresponsive. But 6 to 8 hours later, as the effects wore off, he began to move again, blink again, react to light again. She recorded every detail in a small notebook hidden beneath her pillow. Each line was a piece of evidence. Clara knew she was crossing into dangerous territory. If she spoke up, no one would believe her. If she stayed silent, she would never forgive herself. That night, she stood by Ryder's crib, watching him sleep. His eyelashes fluttered softly under the dim light. He looked peaceful, just like Gabriel once had. A familiar ache returned. She placed her hand over his tiny palm and whispered, "If you can see, if you truly can, I'll prove it, no matter what it takes." Outside, the waves crashed hard against the shore, echoing like the heartbeat of the sea. Clara closed her eyes, tears slipping onto his small hand. And in that fragile, trembling moment, she knew the truth was no longer far away. 3 days after Clara discovered the secret of the eye drops, she still hadn't told anyone. She needed more time to be certain, and a part of her was afraid. Afraid that if she spoke, no one would believe her, or worse, the truth would be buried forever. That morning, a thin mist hung over the sky. Pale light filtered through the glass windows, spilling softly across the floor. Clara prepared the bath for Ryder just like every day. But today she did something different. She decided not to let anyone give him the eye drops. She needed to know what would happen without them. The warm water shimmered under the sunlight, tiny reflections dancing across the surface. Clara carried Ryder in her arms and placed him gently into the basin. He didn't cry, but he wasn't lifeless anymore either. His eyes moved faintly, catching the glimmer of light on the water. Clara held her breath and ran the sponge over his forehead. Foam slipped down his cheek. He blinked. This time the reaction was quicker, clearer. She wiped again closer to his eyes. He blinked once more and then the sound returned. "Mo! Mummy!" Clara smiled through tears. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here," she whispered. But before she could say more, footsteps echoed at the doorway. She turned. Jonathan Pierce stood there. He wore a white shirt, coat draped over his arm, eyes tired but sharp. He had seen everything. His gaze fixed on the scene before him. Clara sitting beside the glass table. His son in a basin of white foam, lifting his head and looking at her. Not staring blankly, but truly seeing. Jonathan stepped forward. "What's happening here?" His voice wasn't raised, but it was heavy with tension. Clara stood quickly. "I was just bathing him like always." She didn't finish. Ryder turned toward the voice. His eyes searched. Then he looked directly at Jonathan. Time stopped. Jonathan froze, his breath caught. He bent down slowly, eyes locked on his son. "Ryder," he whispered, voice trembling. The boy blinked and then smiled. A small, fragile smile, but real. Jonathan clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. His entire world collapsed and rebuilt in the same heartbeat. He knelt beside the table, not caring about his expensive clothes, not caring that he was shaking. He only knew that the child he thought he had lost was looking back at him. You can see me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Ryder didn't answer, but his tiny hand reached out toward Jonathan. A droplet of water slid from his fingertip into his father's palm. Jonathan began to cry. Not loud sobs, but silent tears, the kind that carried months of despair. He lifted the boy carefully, letting Ryder's damp body rest against his chest. Clara stood motionless, throat tightening. The scene, simple yet sacred, felt like it was cleansing all the sorrow she had carried for so long. Jonathan looked up, meeting her gaze through tears. "How long have you known about this?" Clara took a breath. 3 days, she said softly, "and I think the problem isn't his eyes. It's the medicine they've been giving him." Jonathan frowned. "Medicine?" She nodded. "The eye drops. I checked. They're expired, and their purpose is to reduce light response. I believe that's what's been keeping Ryder like this." He stood still, eyes wide with disbelief, guilt, and horror. "Oh my God," he murmured. After a long silence, Jonathan spoke again, almost to himself. "I trusted everything they said, the doctors, the experts, the medicine, and I never once really looked at my own son." Clara stepped closer, her voice gentle. "No one is to blame for loving too deeply. Sometimes love is just blinded by fear." Jonathan bowed his head, his shoulders trembling. He looked back at Ryder, who was still watching him, still smiling, sunlight reflecting in his eyes like pieces of the sky. Jonathan reached out, placing his palm gently against his son's cheek. "I see you now," he whispered. "I see you." And in that moment, for the first time, they truly saw each other. That evening, the oceanfront mansion glowed under warm golden light. But inside Jonathan and Clara there was no peace. They sat facing each other in his study, a room once filled with business files and contracts, now turned into a chamber of truth. On the desk lay the bottle of eye drops Clara had spoken of. The label was faded, the writing barely visible, but just looking at it made Jonathan's skin crawl. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his voice tight, trembling with restraint. Clara nodded, gripping the small notebook where she had documented every one of Ryder's reactions over the past few days. "Jan checked it. I searched online. This medicine is meant to reduce light response, not treat blindness. It's expired, and I believe it's what kept him from reacting normally." Jonathan was silent for a long moment. The sound of waves echoed faintly through the glass windows, rhythmic but cold. He stood, opened a drawer, and pulled out a box labelled Ryder Medical Files. "These are all the records since the day he was born," he said, voice low. "I kept everything exactly as the doctor advised. I never looked at them closely." Clara said nothing. Jonathan opened the box. Inside were dozens of papers, prescriptions, diagnostic reports, test results, handwritten hospital letters. He flipped through them slowly, his eyes sharper than they had ever been. One name kept appearing in the top right corner. "Dr. Raymond Kessler, here," he said softly, his hand trembling slightly. He was the first doctor who examined Ryder. "He told me my son had no pupillary reflex that he would never see." Clara pulled out her phone. "Can you show me his full name?" He nodded, handing her the paper. She typed it into the search bar. After a few seconds, multiple results appeared on the screen. She read aloud, her voice shaking. "Dr. Raymond Kessler, medical license revoked last year for conducting unauthorized experimental treatments on infants." The air froze. Jonathan looked up, his eyes wide, blank with disbelief. You said revoked. Yes, Clara whispered. He was under investigation for prescribing the wrong medication to several babies. Some lost their light reflex temporarily, just like Ryder. Jonathan sank into his chair, both hands gripping his head. His body shook, not from anger, but from guilt. My God, what have I let them do to my son? Clara placed her hand on the desk, her tone gentle but firm. You didn't know. They took advantage of your trust, but now you've seen it yourself. Ryder isn't blind, Mr. Pierce. He's been kept in the dark. A long silence followed. Only the wind and distant waves filled the space between them. Finally, Jonathan looked up, eyes red. What do we do now? First, Clara said, we stop the medicine. Not a single drop more. He nodded. I promise. Then, as if remembering something, he stood and went to another cabinet, digging through stacks of old papers. I still have the receipts and the original prescriptions from Kessler's clinic. She joined him, helping to sift through the files. In a worn envelope signed Dr. Kessler, they found the very first prescription clearly stating the drug dosage and a note. Continued long-term use to maintain stability. Clara's hands clenched. Stability. He was blinding the child. Jonathan looked at her, then at the paper in his hand, his voice cracking. I trusted him. After my wife died, I couldn't think straight. I just wanted to save my son, and I never questioned anything. She spoke softly. You've already saved him. You just didn't know it yet. Jonathan lowered his head, hands trembling. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, No one will ever hurt my son again. Not even me. Clara pressed her lips together, eyes filled with quiet strength. We need to make this truth known, not just for Ryder, but for every child he's ever harmed. Jonathan met her gaze, silent for a long moment. Then he turned toward the window, looking out at the dark, stormy sea. The moonlight fell across his face, no longer the face of a man broken by grief, but of a father reborn in truth. He turned back to her, his voice steady. Tomorrow, I'll call my lawyer. I want to start an investigation. Clara nodded, her heartbeat quickening. For the first time, she saw no darkness in his eyes, only the light of truth. Outside, the waves struck the cliffs with renewed force, as if echoing his resolve. The storm had passed, but the fight for justice had just begun. The next morning, the first light of dawn filtered through the white curtains of the oceanfront mansion. It had been so long since Jonathan had let sunlight fill his home. Before, he had kept everything closed, the windows, the curtains, even his heart. But today, everything was different. Ryder lay on a soft rug in the living room, his tiny body stirring slightly, his eyes brighter than ever. Clara sat beside him, watching quietly. There were no drops, no medicine, nothing between the child and the real world. Jonathan descended the staircase and stopped at the final step. He didn't speak, he just watched. The morning light shimmered in Ryder's hair like a faint halo. Look, Clara whispered. He's following the light. Jonathan stepped closer. In her hands, Clara held a small mirror, angling it to reflect sunlight into a dancing beam on the floor. Ryder's eyes moved with it little by little, slow but clear. The boy saw. Jonathan's breath hitched, his heart pounding. He knelt beside his son and leaned in, whispering, Ryder, can you see that? That's the light, son. The boy didn't answer, but he smiled. A real smile, warm and full, no longer random or empty. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She handed Ryder a red toy block. He stared at it for a moment, then reached out and touched it. That simple touch made both adults hold their breath. He's learning to see, Clara whispered. No, Jonathan said softly, his voice breaking into warmth. He's learning to live. From that day on, every morning began with sunlight. Clara drew back the curtains and let the day pour in. Jonathan worked less and spent more time with his son. They created a new ritual, the light hour. Clara cut pieces of coloured paper into circles, triangles, stars, and taped them to the windows. The sunlight passed through, painting the walls with bright patterns. Ryder followed each patch of colour, making delighted little sounds. Jonathan laughed, a sound he hadn't made in months. Every time Ryder giggled, he felt a piece of his heart mending. At first, it was only light. Then came sound. Clara played soft melodies for Ryder to listen to. When the notes filled the air, he turned his head, searching. Every time he heard Jonathan's laugh, he laughed too. In a few short weeks, the mansion that once felt like a tomb of silence transformed into a real home. Light and laughter moved through its halls, filling spaces that grief had once occupied. One afternoon, as Clara wiped the table, she heard footsteps behind her. Jonathan stood there holding Ryder. The boy was pointing toward the window, where the golden light of sunset painted the wall in glowing stripes. "You like the light, don't you?" Jonathan asked, his voice full of wonder. Ryder nodded faintly, his lips moving. "The light?" The room fell silent. Jonathan turned to Clara. She had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. It was his first word. Light. Jonathan bent down, holding his son close, laughing through tears. "That's right, Ryder. That's the light, and you brought it back to us." That evening they shared dinner, not as employer and maid, but as something much closer to family. Jonathan told Clara about his late wife, about the years before everything fell apart. Clara listened quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking away to hide her emotion. Before leaving the table, Jonathan said softly, "Thank you, Clara. Without you, I'd still be living in the dark." She replied gently, "No, Mr. Pierce. Ryder brought you back to the light. I just opened the window. Outside, the waves whispered against the shore, but the sound was no longer lonely. It blended with the rhythm of a house that had finally woken up from the long sleep of grief." A week after Jonathan decided to file the lawsuit, the atmosphere in the mansion was completely different. The light and laughter were still there, but beneath it all flowed a new current, determination. The living room had become a temporary workspace. On the table lay stacks of files, copies of prescriptions, photos, expired certificates, and reports from other hospitals. Clara sat at the corner of the table, carefully writing down every small detail in her notebook, while Jonathan spoke on the phone with his lawyer. "Yes, I want to file an official lawsuit." His voice was deep and resolute. "Not just for my son, but for all the other children who were deceived." When he hung up, Clara looked up. "What did the lawyer say?" "He'll be here this afternoon," Jonathan replied. "We need to prepare all the evidence." The two worked tirelessly through the morning. Clara organised her notes, clipping each sheet in chronological order, while Jonathan went through the medical files, marking irregularities in red. Every line on paper now felt like an old wound being reopened. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. A middle-aged man in a grey suit stepped in. Mr. Richard Hayes, the lawyer Jonathan had hired. His face was calm, his eyes sharp, but not cold. "Mr. Pierce," he said, shaking hands. "I've reviewed the files. We have a very strong case, but we'll need a witness." Jonathan nodded and turned to Clara. "She's the one who discovered everything." Mr. Hayes looked at Clara and gave a faint smile. "You're the one who saved the boy." Clara blushed slightly, bowing her head. "I just saw what others overlooked." "And that," Mr. Hayes said, "is exactly what justice needs most." They sat down. Jonathan retold the entire story from his wife's death to the diagnosis of blindness, the months of despair, the moment Ryder called Mummy in the bathtub, and finally the discovery of the expired eye drops. Clara added each small detail, her voice trembling but steady. Mr. Hayes took notes non-stop. When they finished, he looked up, his tone grave. "What you've just shared could open not just a lawsuit, but a national investigation." Jonathan clenched his fists. I don't care about reputation. I just want the truth to be seen, Clara nodded, and to make sure no child ever has to live in darkness because of an adult's mistake. Once the truth came to light, Jonathan and his lawyer officially filed a lawsuit against Raymond Kessler for medical fraud and harm to infants. Clara became the most important witness. In court, she described how she discovered the expired medication and Reiter's real reactions after it was stopped. Her testimony left the entire courtroom in silence. Jonathan also took the stand, admitting his mistake for having trusted blindly and affirming that he would never allow another child to live in darkness because of adult negligence. After many days of trial, all the evidence was revealed. The court found Dr. Raymond Kessler guilty, permanently revoked his medical license, and sentenced him to 10 years in prison for medical fraud and causing harm to children's health. As he left the courthouse, Jonathan said only one short sentence to the press. "Justice can't bring back the years my son spent in darkness, but maybe it can make sure no child ever loses their light again." Clara stepped out beside him, holding Ryder in her arms. The little boy reached toward the sunlight, smiling brightly, and in that moment they both knew light had finally won. 3 months after the trial, life slowly returned to peace. But it was no longer the peace of silence and loneliness. It was the calm that comes after a storm. The seaside mansion that had once been dark was now filled with light. White curtains were always drawn open, letting in the scent of salt and the gentle sound of waves kissing the shore. Inside that house, there were no more cries, only laughter. One morning, as the sun rose, Ryder stopped and turned to Clara, his voice bright and curious. "Miss Clara, why is the sun so bright?" She smiled, bent down, and gently brushed his hair. "Because it's not afraid of the dark, Ryder." Jonathan stood behind them, hearing the exchange. A faint smile crossed his face. The sunlight touched his features, and in his eyes the woman before him was no longer just a maid. She was the light that had led him out of the abyss. That evening, Jonathan sat in the living room. On the table was a photo of Ryder, the boy beaming with joy, holding the shiny silver spoon he had once loved so much. The sunlight from the window fell across his face, making his eyes look like they held the entire sky. Clara walked in, holding a small bouquet. "You still keep that photo?" Jonathan smiled. "Yes, I look at it every morning." Clara smiled softly, placing the flowers in a vase. Ryder will grow up knowing that his father fought for the truth for his child and for all the other children too. "Because of you, Clara," Jonathan said slowly. Clara paused for a moment, then gave a faint, wistful smile. "I only did what I had to do." Jonathan looked at her, his gaze warm. "Thank you. You're the miracle God sent to me in Ryder."